Hey everyone, this is Ellie Mae with Swift Creek Customs, and today I wanted to share with you how you can create your own custom shadow boxes in the Siser Leonardo Design Studio software easily. I'm going to share with you all the tips and the steps that I used when I created this shadow box. Here's a closer photo. Here's the original photos from the box that I created for Siser and presented to them when I was at their headquarters in March of 2023. And I'm going to show you exactly how I created it. You can create it in the Siser Leonardo Design Studio software basic version. All of these tools are basic tools within the software, and you can use this to customize your box however you would like. So let's take a look how we can easily create a shadow box within the software. So the first thing you need to do is take apart your shadow box, and you need to measure inside of your shadow box and decide how you want to create this. There's nothing worse than getting all of your design done and realizing it doesn't fit in that shadow box. In this particular one, there's an insert, and you also need to keep in mind the frame on the front if it's going to hide any part of your frame. Okay, so I open up Leonardo Design Studio software, and in the top, I am already on the design page, but the home page is where it first opens up. Simply click on the design tab and it takes you to the design map for your Leonardo Design Studio software. So I'm going to start with some basic features. All of this is going to use basic tools. So the first one, I'm going to come down here to the draw shapes. I do want to make a note that you may see additional icons on my software because I have the pro version active on my computer. But all of the tools that I'm going to be using are in the basic software. So just in case you see those extras, I'm going to click on the draw rectangle tool, and then I'm going to hold my shift key down and I'm going to draw a rectangle. Now I don't have to make this exactly the right size that I need. I simply want to put a rectangle on my screen because I can come over here to my properties panel on the right hand side. With this lock closed, it's going to be proportional, which means if I held my shift key down, it's going to be a perfect square. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to use the measurements that I just took from my shadow box. I'm going to change that to 8.5 and hit enter. With that lock closed, it's going to proportionally change both of those. So it'll change the width and the height proportionally. If it's unlocked, it will only change the dimension that you select. Now, throughout this tutorial, I am going to be using the layers panel because once we start designing and getting multiple layers and we're going to have multiple copies, it's going to be handy for you to be able to name those layers. So I'm going to come over here to the layers panel on the right hand side, and you can see I simply have one layer so far, or one object on my layer one. I can double click on that and it brings up the name. I'm going to name this background so we can kind of keep these straight, because I'm going to be making multiple copies along the way because I always want to have the steps that I use to recreate this project in case I need to go back and either edit it or start over. I'd rather start from a starting point than from the very, very beginning. So I'm going to Control C, Control V, and I'm going to move a copy over here. Now that's going to say background. Double click on it and I can say background copy. And then what I'm going to do is this one, I need another copy. So I'm going to start by creating the different layers for my shadow box. So I'm going to Control C, Control V, and on this copy, I'm just going to decrease the size by grabbing the corner bounding box just a little bit so you can see this. And then I'm going to come to the color picker. I'm going to change this color so you can see it on screen a little bit easier. With this top box selected, I want to change this to 7.75. Now your measurements are going to be dependent on your shadow box and how you measured. It's also going to be dependent on you and your personal preference. How thick do you want the frame to be on your shadow box? You want to keep in mind the edges of your glass, how far is going to be hidden by a shadow box. All shadow boxes are going to be different. And your designs. How thick or thin do you want your frame? I'm going to left click and select both of these. Come down here to my align tools in my toolbar, center align, and then align horizontally. So now I have my beginnings of my frame. If I come back over here to my layers panel with both of these objects selected, you can see I have two of these objects selected. I'm going to Control C, Control V, and I'm going to move this copy off. And then what I'm simply going to do is right click and I'm going to group this. Again, I said every step I go, I want to keep copies. There are some things that you do in the software that are permanent, such as welding, which we'll get to in just a second. Once you save your file, welding cannot be undone. So I want to make sure to have those different steps for my shadow box. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say copy layer 1. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here to my first layer. These are currently 2 squares stacked on top of each other. What I want is a frame. So with both my squares selected, I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose paths, combine paths, and that's going to cut that top rectangle out of the bottom. It's going to give me a frame. And you probably guessed it, Control C, Control V. I'm going to make a copy of this. This is going to be my frame copy. If I click back on here, it's going to select that shape. I'm going to name that frame 1. Now, if you don't use the layers panel, that is just fine. I found the more layers I started adding into this design file, it was much easier to be able to select objects when I knew what they were. So here is my first layer that's going to stack on top of my background, which is going to be a photo. I'm going to bring in a file from the design library, and this is where you can create your personal designs. You create your shadow box. I was creating this shadow box personally for Siser to present to them. So I brought in the shape of Italy, clicked on it and clicked Open Design, and it's going to open up really small. If I come back over here to my Properties panel and click on the color picker, I can easily size this to about 8 inches tall because I know that's what my shadow box is. That's going to be a 1-2 click, a simple way you can resize that if you know what dimensions you are using. And then I can come in and I can make even more adjustments as needed. Now our next steps are going to be to weld to this frame. So again, weld is a permanent tool that you use in the software. In order to weld to an object, they need to be overlapping. So if I were to move this down here and I selected both of them and I chose weld, there's nothing to weld it to because the 2 objects are not overlapping. If I move this back up here, I'm going to position it how I would like it. In this case, I want the top of Italy to overlap at the top of the shadow box, the heel here to overlap on the right, and this area here needs to overlap on the bottom because it is not connected to the boot of Italy. Once I have that selected, I'm going to come back over here to my layers panel. So currently, Italy has its own name because it came from the design library. I'm going to left click and select both of these, and you guessed it, I'm going to Control C, Control V, and make a copy. And I do that because weld, which is our next step, is permanent. So I have this selected here. This is my copy. You can see in my layers panel, there are 2 objects selected with a gray selection box. I'm actually just going to group these together. Now the difference between group and weld is group, there's still 2 objects. When I come up here to my design mat, I have Italy is 1 object and my frame is a second object. I'm going to, with my frame selected, hold my shift key down and click on the Italy. Next, I'm going to choose right click and choose paths and weld. Now you can find the same tools up here in the top left menu, but I'm a right click person. So I'm going to right click paths, weld, and you're going to see those 2 shapes combined. Because those objects are overlapping, it combines those 2 objects into 1. Now it's going to cut all as 1 object. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to type in box layer 1. So we have created our first layer of our shadow box. I am going to simply come in here, change the color so that we can begin to create again. Now I'm going to come down here to 100%, and 100% means it's going to show you everything you have on your design mat. If you need to zoom in on something, you're going to use the magnifying glass or the keyboard shortcuts. I use the magnifying glass, and I'll show you that here in just a second. So next I need to grab this frame, and I'm going to Control C, Control V, and I'm going to make another copy and drag it up onto my design mat. Then I'm going to zoom in here, left click and drag with my magnifying glass. And I'm going to come over to my layers panel. This one, it made a copy. This is going to be box layer 2. And then what I want to do is I want to move this. I want to align it together. So I'm going to select both of them. Align middle, align vertical and horizontal. This way I can design my next layer, keeping in mind relationally where the first layer is. And that'll make more sense here in just a second. So what I need to do first is I'm going to open up the Romeo and Juliet logos that I have permission to use. I'm going to come over to File, Open, and I'm going to come out to where I have those saved. I'm going to click on this. I need to choose Cut Only. It is an SVG file, and I'm going to click Apply, and that brings in my design. So I'm just going to move this over here and zoom in so you can see this. So I have my Romeo and my Juliet. And the first thing I want to do is I'm going to change this color so you can see it better when I get to designing. They are currently grouped together. So I'm going to right click and ungroup. And then I know from working with this before that the trademark symbol is not grouped to Romeo. So I want to select both of that and choose group. So now I have Romeo, and the reason I'm designing on top of the layer is because I want to be able to place this over here so I can get and judge the distance, and I don't want it to overlap on top of my Italy, on top of my bottom layer. So I want to make sure that there's enough space that it's going to stand out apart from it. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating an offset. So once I have this set up exactly how I would like it, I'm going to actually hold my shift key down and select both of these. I'm going to decrease this just a little bit because what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating an offset for this layer to be added onto. So what I want to do is with both Romeo and Juliet selected, right click, and I'm going to group those together so they move as one object. And then I'm creating an offset. So I'm going to come down here to my build contours with Romeo and Juliet selected, build contours, and I do not want print and cut. I want editable contour, and then I'm going to increase the offset amount. So I'm just going to make this, and I want this to be exaggerated because I don't want these little spaces in here. I want it to be all one large offset, and that looks good. There was a little space here. The larger the offset, the easier it's going to be to work with, and it's going to make it stand out more. So once I have that, I'm going to click Apply, and then you can see I have an offset. It is not over top of my Italy shape. And I'm simply going to select the Romeo and Juliet, and I'm going to move that aside because I don't need it any longer. Now let's come over here to the layers panel. I'm going to click on the offset for Romeo and Juliet. And when I do that, you can see that the gray selection box is around it. It also highlights my shape here. So I want to put offset RJ, just so I know what that means. And then what I want to do, select my outer frame, my box layer 2, hold my shift key down, and you'll notice when an object is ready to be selected, you're going to see green lines around it when you move your mouse over it. So I know that's going to be the object that is going to be selected. And I can see here my offset is selected and my second layer. Control C, Control V, and I'm going to move that off of my design mat. And then what I'm going to do is I also want to right click and just group that together so they're into one grouping. That just keeps it easier to work with. And those pieces aren't going to move if I need to go back. Now group, I can undo. So I can right click and I can choose ungroup. But once I weld it, which is our next step, if I click on Romeo and Juliet offset here, hold my shift key down, click on the black frame, you can see here, they're both selected. I'm going to right click, paths, weld. Once that happens, it is now one shape. So this is box layer 2 RJ. And then I have the basics of my shadow box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually make a copy of this background here. Control C, Control V. I'm going to change the color of this so you can see it a little bit better. Let's make it. And then since I made a copy, it actually put it in front. There's two ways you can work with this. So the easiest way is going to be to right click, choose order, and send to back. That is the absolute easiest way in this case. But you can also grab it here in the layers panel and you can drag it back as well. Either one, in this case, it'll work either way. It's just how you are comfortable with the software. So I'm going to left click and select all 3 layers that I have here, use my align tools. And then I'm going to bring this Romeo and Juliet over on top. So, and now it's not on top. So here we go. This is, I'm going to undo that. This is my group. I am just going to rename this so I know what it is. And then I need to bring that to the front. And now it's on top of that second layer. I'm simply positioning this on the screen so you can see how it's going to look. And there I have the 3 layers for my shadow box. I took it one step farther and this is what I did. This is a very unique shadow box for very specific people. So I came in here and I chose open and I went and found a vector image of Verona. This was one of the places we visited in Italy. I chose cut only and I chose next, apply. So now if I zoom in here, I have this, and let's change the color of this to something really obnoxious so you can see it. That's the hard part about video, is getting everything so you can see it. So what I did is I'm going to show you the photo of the shadow box. You can see on the very front, I have placed Siser etched vinyl of this silhouette of Verona. It's cut out of the Siser etched vinyl and it is placed on the back side of the glass of the shadow box. So it added another dimension to my shadow box. And it also added an additional personal meaning. So I took this on the screen and this is the size it came in at. I simply enlarged it and I gave it a little bit extra wiggle room. You can see over here there's not much on the silhouette for dimension or that part of the city. It was just landscape. So I kind of just stretched that a little bit so I would have some wiggle room on my edges when I was applying that. And then I'm going to show you a photo here of the 3 additional shadow boxes that I made after I came back from the headquarters in Detroit. I made one for myself and then I shipped out to the 2 friends. As you can see, I even personalized this shadow box even more because on the side of Verona is the Colosseum. We walked all the way up to the top. Well, Tony ran, but we all walked to the top of the Colosseum and up there we took a photo. So I took that photo and I printed it and I added it in to this shadow box at the top of the Colosseum. So this is a great way, while I use this to personalize for a gift to Siser and to my friends, this is a great way you can take your shapes, your text, you can personalize and create custom shadow boxes very easily using the basic tools in the Leonardo Design Studio software or whatever software program that you are using to create it. So I'm going to also give you a look at and some tips on the assembly. I will say that by the time you get to doing it the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th time, you pick up additional tips and you get better along the way on how you put the box together. So let's take a look at that. So the first step is to cut all of your pieces that you need for the shadow box. So I'm going to show the process here. It's all sped up. I've cut this, it was a couple hours to finish all of these projects, but I cut it down. I did my test cuts. I ended up doing 2 test cuts. Test cuts are your best friend, and it's so simple from the Siser Juliet or Romeo touchscreen. The only one you can blame if you don't do your test cuts is yourself, if your material doesn't cut right. So simple. You know, these shadow box pieces cut out fairly quickly. Go slow, flip your mat over, peel your mat away from your cardstock. That will help to keep it from rolling and to keep it flat. Make sure your debris is off of your mat. I scraped the little test cut pieces off there, and then I sent my second layer of my shadow box to cut. And sometimes you end up with these little pieces on the edges of your cardstock. Simply grab a pair of scissors or just peel those off real carefully. And then just be careful doing this. Now I cut at a speed of 10 with my cardstock. Juliet is super fast, but it's not always great to cut at a fast speed. It just depends on your materials and your design. So after I was done cutting with that, I needed to cut my vinyl. So I changed my blade from my cardstock blade to my vinyl blade, and then I got out my paper trimmer and I cut down my piece of vinyl. And I do this all the time because there's no reason to stick a full sheet to my cutting mat and then rip a full sheet off of my cutting mat and use up all that adhesive. I can save the adhesive on my vinyl or on my cutting mat if I just cut my piece down. So I did my test cut for my silver vinyl, and then I sent it to cut, and it cut beautifully. Even the little tiny trademark symbols, I will show that here in just a second, but I took that off. And then the next part here, you can see the little fine details. I'll show a photo up close of that here in just a second. But then I cut down my piece of vellum that I needed, and I actually ended up having to cut the vellum a couple times when I went to make the 3 additional shadow boxes, only because I messed up, or I would put it on the glass in the wrong spot and it didn't look right. So I just peeled it off, cut a new piece, and then attach that. You know, it's great that you have a cutting machine and you can cut your materials again if you do mess up. So then this is a very detailed design of the silhouette of the Verona, and it cut beautifully. And I'll show here, peel that off as well, cut it down, and then I weeded this part here. I always protect my mat, put that cover back on when I am done to save the adhesive, and just go slow when you're doing this. Vinyl is very fragile at times. They etched vinyl because you can tear it easily. There's a close-up of that Romeo and Juliet. I lost one of those trademark symbols, not during the cut, but actually during the weeding process. So I cut extras. And then I decided after the first one I just used foam tape and I stacked it. Well, that worked okay. But since I was making 3 additional boxes, I ended up with this black foam core board. It's like the plastic signs that you see out in your yard. I just bought it at Michael's. And you can see I'm making 3 of them. So I needed enough to do all 3 of the shadow boxes and got it all done. So each one of those pieces, I needed 2 per side per layer because I wanted to give it the dimension that it needed. And here I'm cleaning up my workspace after cutting all of those pieces of foam board. And then I counted how many I needed per shadow box. And I have cut a lot of the assembly out of this just because once you do one layer, the next layer is basically the same. So here I am doing the adhesive vinyl, the silver Romeo and Juliet, and I place that onto the top layer. If you use transfer tape, you want to make sure that it's not super sticky and then it won't peel back your cardstock. And here's a close-up again of that applied to the shadow box. And then I went ahead and I put the transfer tape onto my etched vinyl as well. And you just want to go slow, even though I look like I'm working fast. The video was recorded at a time lapse of 4. Now with the photo, I just needed a square cut down. There was no need to put it into my cutting machine and to mess with the dimensions and to try to do that. So I just took my paper trimmer and cut it down to the size that I needed. Sometimes we make things too complex when we have a cutting machine and think we have to do everything on it. Watch those little tabs on the backs of your shadow boxes. If you bend them too much, then they will break off and you'll have to glue that in. Now on this first one, I pulled this foam sheet out of the shadow box. Some shadow boxes won't have it, but I realized that that was a lot of work. The next ones, I just left it in and used it as part of my dimension. And then I'm using double-sided sticky tape, and I needed to tape 2 layers on each of these. So I just ended up putting the tape on first and then added that into the shadow box layer. So there's 2 layers of the foam core board, and I'm taking all the pieces off. Now, when you have parts that are inside of your shadow box layers like Italy and then the Romeo and Juliet, you also need to add foam tape to add that dimension and make it stand up. Here, I didn't have enough foam tape on the Romeo and Juliet because it was like 4 layers deep from my photo. So I needed to add some more. And then once I had everything as I wanted it, I could add it to the full frame. And like I said before, once you got down to the second, third, and fourth one, you pick up new tips. Obviously, I had to recut my etched vinyl because I messed up the first one. I learned along the way that if I added painter's tape, you'll see that here, and used it as my line to line up where I needed that vinyl to go, then I could easily apply that. And I needed to apply it so that it could be seen both outside of the edges of that shadow box frame from the front. And then I just simply removed that. Now be very careful with the glass in your shadow boxes. The edges are very, very sharp. And that's why you see me carefully, it doesn't look so in the video, but carefully lifting that up and trying not to scrape myself on it. And then wipe to clean off the glass with all the fingerprints before you place it in the box for final assembly. Close those little tabs if needed, and those tabs aren't holding, I use some hot glue on one. There's the final photo from the video of the assembly. And here are the final finished photos of the shadow box. Now it did take time to make them, but it was so worth it. And it's easily created in the Siser Leonardo Design Studio software with the basic tools. I hope that you've enjoyed this. Thanks for joining me and have a great day.